Hey people, everybody likes wonders. Let's talk about what makes a wonder in Civ 3 good. So we got one main criteria that we're looking at here, and that's how useful is it to have this wonder, whatever the wonder is, in your toolkit. Now, it's actually surprisingly hard to define what makes a wonder good, and if you care about that kind of debate, then you can check the description of this video for the fine print, but if you don't really care too much, let's just get right into it. So, the first wonder and the worst wonder on our list is the Oracle. This thing is just absolute trash. So, it only gives bonus happiness. You might think that it doubles the effect of the culture from your temples too. That's not the case. It's just the happiness. It expires super quickly. It's the quickest wonder to expire in the game. The effect is tiny. It's worse than a single luxury, and you have to build it super, super early. And on top of that, you have to build the temples too to get any effect out of it. It's just so awful. Like it is a tourist attraction, but you're never going to get all the tourist attractions, and you might as well build all the other ones. If you're building a wonder early enough to actually get the Oracle, then you should be building the Colossus or the pyramids or pretty much anything else instead of this, because you're much better off in that case. Next on our list is the Manhattan Project. This one, I understand why it exists in theory. It makes a ton of sense, but the thing is, you don't really need nukes in Civ 3 if you have a tech lead. And if you have a tech lead, or if you don't have a tech lead, just wait for the AI to build it. It's not that hard. It has less culture than all the other modern era wonders around this time, so it's not even useful in a one city culture victory. So even though it makes sense that this wonder exists, it's just not a useful tool in your toolkit to have. You just wait for someone else to build it, and then you can build the nukes that way. So next on our list is longevity. So undeniably, this is the best effect of any wonder in the game if it was available at a reasonable time frame. It comes too late for it to do absolutely anything. By this point, your cities are already likely capped in population, and so you don't actually get any value about this. So I guess it would be useful to, if you got nuked and you needed to recover and grow your population up from there and build a bunch of workers and maybe some settlers, but that's just not a very likely scenario. I wouldn't recommend building this at all. Next on our list is the SETI program. So this thing costs 1,000 shields. It's very hard for this to pay for itself unless you're wonder stacking. And even if the game drags, the tech tree is almost over. And there's just not that many good things at the end of the modern era tech tree. Pretty much the only reason you would want to build this and get good value out of building this is if you wanted to, if you're hard committed to a space race victory and you want to get all the spaceship parts. But even in that case, I'd still recommend doing the internet instead of this wonder. Next on our list is Cure for Cancer. It's a happiness wonder. I don't have much to say about happiness wonder. This one isn't that good. I guess maybe you could get value out of it if you have a big enough empire. So next on our list is the internet. So this one costs the same as SETI, but has a bigger chance of being useful. It gives you culture in every single city, which makes it very useful for many types of victory conditions, all of which really, really suck. So the 100k culture is the most trash victory condition in the world. Space race, I generally do not like space race victories. I think you're much better off going for an early domination victory, or for one city culture, or for diplomatic victory. But if you've missed the boat on all of those, I guess you have to win the game somehow. So this would be a useful wonder in that case for doing that. I haven't actually tested this out, but the research lab gives you pollution. So correct me if I'm wrong, but this wonder will just put pollution on all your cities. A fun side effect to an already pretty underwhelming wonder, but yeah. Okay, so next on our list is universal suffrage, which is honestly the most trash wonder in the game. I would put it at the bottom of the list, but technically it is useful for a one city culture victory because it's available earlier than all the other modern era wonders I mentioned in this video. And there's no other wonders you have to compete with in the industrial era. You're not going to get the Oracle because if you're doing wonders, you're busy building all the other useful wonders in the ancient era, but there's only 3 in the industrial era, and they're all pretty easy to lock down. So if you're going for one for city culture victory, you might as well get this, but the actual effect itself, although it sounds good on paper, is actually total trash. So you might think it reduces, it cuts your war weariness in half, which you can easily get 20 unhappy citizens of war weariness if you have the highest level of war weariness in republic or democracy. But it actually only gives you 1 happy face in the event that your cities are experiencing war weariness. So for this to do literally anything, first of all, you have to be in republic, feudalism, or democracy. You have to be at war, and you have to have accumulated a war weariness score. If any of those are untrue, then this wonder does absolutely nothing. If all of those are true, it has the most marginal effect in the world. So this wonder is good for the culture, otherwise it's just absolute trash. Next on our list is the Temple of Artemis. This is a really peculiar wonder. You might think of it as a happiness wonder, but I think it's better to see it as a border expand wonder. It gives you a border expand on all your cities in the continent. Because the happiness effect, especially because the happiness effect expires, the happiness effect is quite marginal relative to the strength of the border expand. It's a strong ability, but the cost is just so high. It can be good for like military strats or for just generally like building a bunch of cities or having a bunch of cities early in the game. It's good to have like a temple when you conquer a new enemy city, but culture flips are like, you're more at risk for culture flips later at the game when this has already expired. You might think that this is useful for 100k culture victories, but it actually isn't. You want to avoid this if you're going for 100k culture. Again, 100k culture is trash, so don't go for it, but if you did, you wouldn't want to use this. So the reason for that is you should understand how culture doubling works. So I believe it's after 1,000 years, it's after a set number of years, the culture you get from a wonder or an improvement doubles. So obviously between 3000 and 2000 AD, that's like what, like 40 turns? Whereas between 1000 AD and 2000 AD is like 200 turns or something like that. So the earlier you build culture victories, like exponentially, it means that you get a faster doubling on the culture value. So for this reason, you might see me put a strong weight to the early wonders on this list because they actually give more culture than they look because the cultural value doubles so quickly. So for the exact same reason that I just mentioned, you lose all your temples when you get education. And so all the doubling effect that you've racked up is just gone now. You have to rebuild the temples and you lose that doubling effect until you wait another 1,000 years. So if you're doing one city culture victory, 100k culture victory, or even one city culture victory, this kind of messes you up because you have to rebuild those temples. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend this wonder, it's kind of okay. If you want to go for it, but I'd say think about why you're building it and what you're getting out of it. Next on our list is Magellan's Voyage. So you might think that this is like an expansion wonder, but by the time you build it, naval expansion is just completely done. So this is exclusively a military building. Airports and air bases basically make it obsolete. I wouldn't recommend using transports to ship your units around. By the time you can just turn any worker into an airbase for 5 shields and 10 food, and just make an airbase and import all your units that way. So this is good for naval invasions of other continents, but not much else. There's like some decent utility out of it. But honestly, like the end of the medieval era is just such a fertile ground because there's so many different wonders and they're all down like different tech paths and you really have to choose which ones you're going to go for. And I wouldn't recommend going for this one because there are better options. It's just a flat movement rate increase. It's good to have if you can get it without sacrificing any of the other useful wonders from this era, but it wouldn't be top of my priority list. I guess I should say that if you're like building a lot of boats in the late game and you're using a lot of boats, then this is worth building. Like I think if you're using like 10 carriers, you're playing the game badly, but if you are doing that, then this is a good one. You should build this wonder if that's the case. Okay, next on our list is Knights Templar. This one is, I don't know, it's pretty like if you have the option to get it, it's cheap. I would get it, but the effect is kind of marginal. Strong infantry aren't that important. Generally, you want more mobile units, especially around this era. Yeah, you can't delay getting steam power to milk this wonder for more units. Steam power is the most important tech of the game. So relative to the Temple of Artemis, like you're going to get much fewer Crusaders than you get Ancient Cavalry, and the Ancient Cavalry are arguably just as good or better units than the Crusaders are. So I don't like this one so much, but if you have the option to get it, you can get it. So next on our list is Shakespeare's Theatre, which is a really good wonder. Sadly, it's one that's not really practical. The issue is that to get it, you need 2 technologies that are not required for era advancement. You need democracy and free artistry. So what that means is that you'll be delaying steam power, which is the most powerful tech in the game, by 8 turns, 20 turns, 30 turns, however many turns it takes you to research these technologies. You can't even really trade for these technologies because democracy is so massively overvalued by the AI. The AI really, really values any tech that unlocks a government. So if you try to trade for democracy, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. So even though this wonder is really good for one city culture, really good for like growing like a hyperscaling, grow tall hypercap, it's not really practical because the tech is so hard to research. And there's already so many other like tech detours in the late medieval era that unlock good wonders, like music theory, like economics. And of course, you want to go for Newton's University, which thankfully is on the main tech path. So this one is often one I leave behind, even though I'd really like to use it more often. Next on our list is the Great Wall. So this is kind of the opposite. I don't really want to like it, but I've found it to be actually quite good. So walls are like really not the kind of wonder or building that you want in all cities. The reason for that is they're very cheap, they cost no maintenance, and realistically, you probably only need them in 2 or 3 cities. Now, that's the case most of the time, but on very big maps, it can be helpful to have walls in all your cities. The reason for that is that you don't really unlock mobile defensive units until knights. So knights are really the first mobile defensive unit, also the really good mobile attacker. So if the AI just like walks like a swordsman and archer together into your land, onto your hill next to your city, you can't attack into that. You definitely can't attack into that with like a horseman, a mobile unit. So you're stuck defending your cities, and for that, it helps to have walls in all your cities. It just gives you like kind of like a margin of error. Like you can make mistakes and still hold on to your cities, and you don't have to pay like crazy attention to anticipating the different threats. Because on big maps, there's going to be a million AI units walking through all different corners of your land, and you're not going to be able to clean up all of them, especially if they're walking on high defense bonus terrain. On top of that, so yeah, it's really good for defending big empires, especially if like you expand very big. You want to protect that while you wait for knights. It's good for that. But it's also good for, as like a generic tourism gold wonder. It's very cheap in terms of cost. It gives some culture, and it's decently easy to get, even on high difficulty levels. So yeah, good for wonder stacking and good for protecting big empires. I think it's a good wonder. Okay, we got another happiness wonder here, Geospac's Cathedral. I don't have much to say about happiness wonders. This one is down like a really memey tech path where it's just one offshoot to education. Like a lot of the other late medieval stuff, sometimes the AI gets this tech music theory very early. Sometimes they don't get it until the industrial era. So it's a bit of a crapshoot if you go for this, but if you get it, it's a pretty good wonder. So yeah, I like it a bit. Okay, next we have Sistine Chapel. Again, one that I don't normally go for myself, but it actually is a viable alternative for getting a lot of happiness, like an alternative to the normal strategy I use, which is markets plus a ton of luxuries. Yeah, so it's good if you're a religious civ. I wouldn't recommend it if you're not a religious civ unless you're going for a culture victory. But if you are a religious civ, especially on like island maps where you can only trade for maybe 1 or 2 different luxuries, or maybe you have access to no luxuries, this can be a good way to get a lot of happy faces for like a relatively efficient 600 shields. Okay, next we have Leonardo's Workshop, and I'm going to say something absolutely sacrilegious in the Civ 3 community, that I think this wonder is stupidly overrated. It's like a massive quality of life improvement, I'll admit that. You can just upgrade all your defenders when you get to the new era. You don't have to think too much about it, but it's rarely game breaking. There's no crazy offensive plays that you can make with this. Knights are already cheap to upgrade to cavalry. Nothing upgrades to bombers. Nothing upgrades to tanks, which are the offensive units you'd really like to upgrade to. The only like really good offensive power spike you can do with this is cannons to artillery, I guess. Aside from that, there's no strong offensive plays. So you're just paying 600 shields relatively early in the game for a wonder that, I mean, in a practical sense, you're not going to get much tourism gold out of this, and it's very low culture. So you might think it's like saves you a bunch of money because, oh, I'm going to upgrade anyway. But if you compare to the money you save on maintenance from building Sun Tzus or from building Smiths, it's not that much money. And it's actually a little deceptive. Like if you add up all the money, it might like, okay, it's a decent amount. But a lot of that is like upgrades you only did at the margin. Like, so because you built this wonder, it's worth upgrading. But if you hadn't built the wonder, it wouldn't have been worth upgrading. So the gold value of that kind of upgrade is not as high as just the flat gold that you save because you wouldn't have made that purchase otherwise. So for that reason, I think Leonardo's is overrated, and I'd really recommend other wonders. But I mean, it's a good wonder. It's just a good wonder to have, I guess, but not that good. Okay, next we have Hanging Gardens. Pretty much the king of happiness wonders, very middle of the road, but it is tourism gold that is available early, and it's relatively cheap, and it gives you quite a bit of culture if you're doing one city culture victory. Sometimes monarchy can be a tough tech to get early, and you're definitely not going to want to trade for monarchy because, again, government techs are really overrated or overvalued by the AI, but if you can get it, definitely a good wonder to have. Okay, next on our list is the Colossus. So this is cheap, and it gives you 2 different commerce bonuses that stack with the science wonders from the Middle Ages. So that makes it a really, really good wonder, especially on small maps where you don't have many cities, and like your capital is like a big driver for the commerce of your empire. Also great for 1 city culture victories, 3 culture for the price. It's pretty good. Now, I should say this again, do not tank your expansion phase to get these early wonders that the AI will otherwise build early. So don't tank your expansion phase for the Colossus. Don't tank your expansion phase for the pyramids. Just don't build the Oracle at all, but definitely don't tank your expansion phase for it. But if you're in a position where you can build this without tanking your expansion phase, so on low difficulties, that would mean getting out like a handful of cities first before you go for it. On higher difficulty levels, you might get out 1 or 2 cities. But you'd probably only do this in cases where you're not competing for a ton of city spots. So if you got your own island to yourself, or if you got like a choke point, or just very little land in general, this might be worth going for. But otherwise, on higher difficulty levels, like your expansion phase is too important to actually go for this. But yeah, if you can get it, it's a good wonder to have, and I definitely recommend it. Okay, next we have the Great Lighthouse. So this, not too much to say about this. It's fantastic for tech trading, for even like trading luxuries and strategic resources. I think is possible overseas if you have access to this this wonder. Great for expansion, like you can unlock complete islands that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, and that the AI does not have access to yet because they can't go over sea tiles. And it's good for military conquest. It's good for a million different things. Fantastic wonder on sea maps. On Pangea maps and even some continents maps, it's not very good at all. In those maps, I mean, it's a cheap, or relatively cheap, kind of cheap tourism gold wonder that gives some culture. So maybe it's useful for 1 city culture victories. But it's mostly high on this list because of how insanely useful it is on island maps, on archipelago maps. Next on our list is Smith's Trading Company. This is just like a nice, like, commerce is a good thing to have. This wonder gives a lot of commerce. I like it quite a bit. But I know a lot of you guys think this is one of the best wonders in the game, and I'm going to tell you why it's not. So there's one thing holding its back, and that it doesn't actually increase your maximum scientific output. So at this phase of the game, you're probably going to want to be teching at 100% science, and you're going to be running a deficit probably, but you make up that deficit by selling away your techs, either for huge sums of lump sums of gold or for gold per turn from the AI. So even though you're running 100% science slider, you don't go broke if you're playing the game correctly, or not correctly, but if you're playing the game well, at least. So what that means is if you have this wonder, or if you build this wonder while you're doing that strat, then it will increase your surplus or reduce your deficit, but it won't actually increase the maximum rate at which you're teching. It won't increase that 100% science because it just reduces maintenance. It doesn't actually increase your commerce. So because of that, I can't give this wonder a top spot on the list, but it is quite a good wonder. Okay, so we're getting to the really good stuff now, and this is a surprise to me. I thought this wonder was absolute dog shit, because 3 happy faces is just not good at all. That's like a cathedral. That's literally just the effect of a cathedral for 200 shields instead of 160 or 80 or how much of a cathedral costs. The thing that makes this really good as a wonder is it's available super early, it's consistent because the AI does not prioritize philosophy, and it's tourism gold. So I should explain at this point the way that tourism gold works. It's based on the years in the game and not the turn number. So because 2000 BC to 1000 BC is like what? Like 40 turns, 50 turns, whereas 1000 AD to 2000 AD is like 200 turns. So if you get the wonders that give tourism gold early, the doubling, like the stacking of the gold is based on the years. So they'll stack up gold very, very quickly if you build them super early. And this is the one that you can build very early without tanking your expansion phase. So because of that, I like this wonder quite a bit. It's also very good for 1 city culture victories or just wonder stacking in general. Like if you want to get a lot of wonders early on, a lot of tourism gold so that you can get the doubling effects later on. This is a good wonder to have because 3 happy citizens, although like normally I say that 1 happy face is worth 1 commerce, but otherwise you have to use the happiness slider, and the happiness slider affects all your frickin' cities which don't need the happiness. So having 3 happy citizens specifically in the city where you're stacking all your wonders is actually worth quite a bit more gold per turn than 3 happy citizens. it could easily be worth 15 or 20. It lets you grow your cap really big, so you can have a lot of production, which allows you to get the rest of the tourism producing wonders in the ancient era, which are the important ones. So yeah, and normally you should be rushing for philosophy anyway. So this is just a great option to have. Again, if you're competing for city spots a ton, don't build this wonder, but especially on island maps, great wonder to have early on. Okay, speaking of this, so this one is a wonder that's available early, but unlike the Mausoleum, unlike the Colossus, you're not going to want to build this on like small maps, on island maps so much. You're going to want to build this on maps where it's very big, like huge maps or 60% water maps. Maps where you have a lot of city spots to unlock. So this has an incredible effect that lasts the entire game. It will slow down your expansion phase, but it kind of makes up for itself. I wouldn't say that in most cases it will speed up your expansion phase, but it will kind of like break even, where you slow down your expansion phase early, but then you catch up with the extra growth from the granaries it provides and end up with like an average expansion phase. But where this really comes into play is that like the early mid game where you're like transitioning to Republic, it'll grow your cities so quickly. You can get out a ton of workers to do all the tile improvements you need and have a very strong mid game based on the pyramids. So yeah, be careful not to trigger Golden Age if you don't want it. If you're the Celts, if you're the Mayans, if you're the Egyptians, this will give you a Golden Age, so be careful for that. But yeah, if you're playing like a 60% water map or a huge map or a large map, I would recommend building the pyramids. It's a great wonder. It also gives you a bunch of culture and it's tourism gold. For the cost, it might not be the best for that kind of strat, but sometimes it's just going to make sense for you to get it, and if you're stacking tourism or if you're stacking wonders, so it's a good wonder to have in those cases. Okay, next is the Hoover Dam. This is the only wonder in the game that gives you a direct bonus to production, unless I'm missing something here. It is incredibly efficient because the value of like hydroplants are very expensive buildings, and it produces one in every single city in the continent. It even gives you effective like hydroplants that actually work in cities that aren't on rivers, which reduces pollution relative to if you built like a coal plant. Yeah. The one thing to watch out for here is that you do need a factory for these hydroplants to do anything. Otherwise, they just sit around. They don't cost you maintenance, but they don't do anything in the cities that don't have factories. But if you do have factories, again, free power plant, insane thing to have. So this is easy to build even on higher difficult levels, especially with the slingshot from Theory of Evolution that we'll talk about in a bit. And there's no downside to it. It's just free production. My one downside to this, I'd say, is that I don't build like 20 different factories if I have 20 different cities. I maybe have like 5 factories in my core cities. So that's a good thing to have for that. But it's not like, it doesn't give you like the crazy scaling, like continent-wide value that you'd get out of, say, Sun Tzu's Art of War, unless you're planning to go really, really late game and maybe do like a space race victory or something like that. Next on our list is Copernicus's. So at this point, I've been teasing it all video. We should talk about how fucking tourism gold works. So I used to think it was just like flat gold that just went directly into your treasury. It's not like that. It's like any other gold that would be generated from the city, like the gold that's generated from the Colossus. So what does that mean? It means that the gold is subject to corruption, but it's also multiplied by the multipliers you get. So you heard that right. So if you get like, what is it, caps out at 14 tourism gold per wonder. And you can consistently get that by like the mid game if you build like the early wonders like the Colossus, the Mausoleum, even stuff like the Great Wall or the Great Lighthouse. So yeah, once you get that, it's multiplied first of all 100% by your library university chain, and then if you get Copernicus Observatory, it's 100 gold, or sorry, it's 100% on top of that. So you can easily have 40 base gold per turn from tourism, and this wonder multiplies that 40 gold, it doubles it, on top of all the other gold that your city produces. All that other gold is multiplied too. So this wonder is pretty easy to access. It gives a lot of culture. It's fairly cheap. It is an insane wonder for that kind of wonder stacking strat and for the tourism gold stacking strat. And just, I mean, often if you're doing one city culture victories, you're going to be wonder stacking. So it just makes a lot of sense. So Newton's University. So Newton's University has the same effect of Copernicus's. So it's good for all the reasons that Copernicus is good, but I had to rate it a little higher. First of all, because it gives more culture, and second of all, because it's easier to build. So if you go for the Great Library, you kind of have to wait for the AI to do education, for 2 AI to do education, and often you're not the first civ to get astronomy. So it can be sometimes tricky to get Copernicus's, especially if you don't have a pre-build, but Noon's is a lot more consistent because the AI is going to have a million different distractions once they get to the late medieval era. There's all those optional texts that I talked about. The AI also likes to going for metallurgy. You can just beeline straight for theory of gravity, and you can pretty consistently get this wonder as long as you're like even with the AI in terms of tech. So yeah, it gives extra culture, and it's more consistent to access than Copernicus's. So I put it a little higher. Okay, now we're getting to theory of evolution. I love this wonder. It's only 2 texts, so it's not actually that much, but it's so consistent. This is probably one of the easiest wonders to build, even on SID difficulty. Because, like I said, the government texts are really overrated by the AI, and also nationalism, because it gives mobilization and conscription. The AI really values texts that give those abilities. So when the AI gets to the industrial era, they do nationalism, they do communism, they do fascism before they even do medicine. So you can just rush straight for this wonder, and you're probably going to want steam power as soon as possible anyway, and you can consistently get this wonder. And you can use this wonder to get electronics and atomic theory, or whatever the 2 texts are, and get you the Hoover Dam pretty much all to yourself, guaranteed. So yeah, you could also use it to rush towards bombers, if you wanted to, but normally I go for the Hoover Dam, just because they're good trading texts too. Like if the AI is doing industrialization and you skipped that, you can just trade them. I mean, probably even scientific method for industrialization, but atomic theory and electronics too, potentially, if you need the later texts. So yeah, great wonder. Okay, now we have the big daddy, Sun Tzu's Art of War. This is an absolutely absurd return on investment in many situations. It saves you a ton of maintenance. I guess the one downside is you probably have like a lot of barrackses already in the cities that need barrackses, but you'll always need more barrackses. Like as you get a bigger empire, as you unlock less corrupt governments, you're going to have more and more cities that are growing in population and can feasibly produce military land units, so you're going to want barracks in those cities. It's also helpful to have barracks in newly conquered cities. If the AI like suddenly surprises you, you can like rush units in a city, and those units will instantly be veteran. There's just so many quality of life and just like practical uses to this wonder. And if you already have barracks, like I mentioned, you can sell them and you get like a little bit of gold back. I think it's like 5 or 10 gold. But yeah, I could like add up to a decent amount. So I like this wonder quite a bit. I definitely recommend going for it. It's expensive given how early it comes. It's also good to capture this wonder. But if you can build it, I think it's worth building. Okay, so now we're getting to the stupid OP stuff. This one is very cheap, and it is ridiculously cost efficient. It pays for itself after like 3 or 4 or 5 ancient cavalry come out. Remember how I said that like not having mobile defenders early is a downside and makes it hard to manage big empires in the early mid-game? These are mobile defenders, and because of the extra HP, they're actually super tanky on defense too. They're like stronger than the MP. I think like the game devs, like based on this and the fact that they buffed the war elephants the way they did, the game developers just did not understand how much value you get out of +1 HP. So +1 HP is basically just more than plus 25% bonus to both attack and defense, which is very, very strong. So this is great for early game or mid-game conquest. If you're not playing to conquer, this is like the only military building that you'll ever need. These guys will defend your empire for you on their own. And remember everything I said about how the Mausoleum was a really great wonder for wonder stacking? This is really great too. It gives even more culture. 4 culture is actually really insane given it's one of the most cost-efficient culture wonders in the game, actually. And it's a tourism attraction, so you stack tourism gold off this thing. This wonder is just balls to the walls insane. I don't know what the devs were thinking with this. So I think I know what the devs were thinking with this, but I can't put it any lower on the list because the diplomatic victory is just such a consistent way to close out the game. It basically just means that if you have a tech lead at the start of the modern era, you win the game unless you've like really, really messed up your reputation. Like if you've raised a ton of cities, is pretty much the only way that you can be barred from winning a diplomatic victory if you're the person who builds the UN. Because you control when the elections are held, you know when the elections are going to be held, so you just do a military alliance against the other candidate or candidates right before the election, and then all the other civs will vote for you. So There are other ways to qualify for the UN as a candidate, and there are, of course, other ways to win a victory in Civ 3 aside from a diplomatic victory. So for that reason, I can't put the United Nations in the #1 spot, because there is one other wonder that is really, really good at carrying you through the first 3 eras in the game in order for you to have a tech lead by the time you get to the modern era so that you can close out the game with this wonder or through whatever other means. And the wonder I'm talking about for the #1 spot is, of course, the Great Library. Now, this is just a stupid wonder. It gives you a boatload of cash. What you do is you just set your science at 0%, and the AI does all the teching for you until the AI gets to education. So, to clear up a misunderstanding, it doesn't just give you any techs held by 2 civilizations at the time that it's built. It continues to do so until the AI gets to education, and the wonder expires then. So yeah, the AI also doesn't prioritize literature, so this is buildable on any difficulty level. It is the most commonly built wonder on Cid. You can kind of take your time with it. It also gives you a shit ton of culture, like the most of any ancient era wonder for some reason. So if you're going for one city culture victory, this is fantastic. It gives you tourism gold, as if you needed more gold when you were building this wonder. And on top of that, it gives you all those techs. So remember when I said that Theory of Evolution was the 5th best wonder in the game? This gives you 2 techs. The Great Library. It gives you like 20 techs. This wonder gives you like 20 techs between the ancient era all the way up to the halfway through the medieval era. It is just so stupidly overpowered. I love it so damn much. So yeah, this is without a doubt the best wonder in the game. So if you skip to the end of the video and you want to know what is the general deal with this video, here's my tier list. The bad stuff's on top, the good stuff is at the bottom, and the in-between stuff is in between. So yeah, let me know in the comments of this video what you think of my tier list and if there's any changes you'd make. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.